There are actors who become famous. And then there are actors who become permanent. Gregory Peck was the second kind. From the moment he stepped in front of a camera in 1944, something about this man stopped people cold. Not just because of the height, those 6 feet 3 inches of calm, composed masculinity certainly didn't hurt. Not just because of the voice, which carried the weight of a man twice his age even in his 20s. It was something deeper. Something harder to name. A quality that made audiences feel, instinctively, that they were watching a person who meant every single word. His career stretched across 5 decades. He earned 5 Academy Award nominations. He won one, for a role that didn't just win him a statue but permanently fused his identity with one of the most morally significant characters in American literary history. Atticus Finch. The quiet lawyer who stood up for a man no one else would defend, in a town that punished him for it, and never once raised his voice. That performance, in 1962's To Kill a Mockingbird, was more than acting. It was a statement. It told the world exactly what kind of man Gregory Peck believed a person ought to be. Calm under pressure. Decent without fanfare. Willing to do the right thing even when the right thing cost you everything. The American Film Institute later voted Atticus Finch the greatest hero in cinema history. Not a soldier. Not a superhero. A father and a lawyer standing in a courtroom in Alabama, doing what was right. People trusted Gregory Peck on screen because they sensed something genuine behind the performance. And they weren't wrong. Those who knew him personally described a man who lived by the same principles his characters embodied. Dignified. Thoughtful. Loyal. Slow to speak and slow to anger. A man who listened more than he talked, and who remembered more than he let on. But here's the thing about men who are very good at being composed, their silences can hold enormous worlds inside them. And Gregory Peck's silences, especially in his later years, held something that the cameras never fully captured, something he was not ready to say aloud for most of his life. Before Hollywood, before Atticus Finch, before any of it, there was a quiet boy growing up in La Jolla, California, with the Pacific Ocean stretching out in front of him and a family breaking apart behind him. Gregory Peck was born Eldred Gregory Peck on April 5, 1916. His parents divorced when he was only 5 years old, and the separation left a mark that biographers would spend decades trying to fully understand. His father, a pharmacist, remained in the picture but at a distance. His mother stepped away further. And so young Gregory was largely raised by his maternal grandmother, a warm, steady woman who became the most important person in his early life. She had a ritual that would change everything. Every week, without fail, she took him to the movies. Think about that for a moment. A small boy, a darkened theater, and story after story flickering across a screen. Heroes speaking with conviction. Villains meeting justice. Fathers protecting families. Ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage. Week after week, season after season, those images soaked into him. Not as entertainment alone, but as a kind of education in what it meant to be human. He was not a loud child. He watched. He absorbed. He thought carefully before he spoke, even then. Those who knew him in those early years described a boy who seemed slightly older than his age, slightly more serious, slightly more interested in understanding people than in impressing them. He attended St. John's Military Academy, where discipline became second nature. Then came the University of California, Berkeley, where he studied English literature and pre-medical coursework simultaneously, a combination that tells you everything about how his mind worked. The science of the body. The art of the soul. He wanted to understand both. Acting came almost sideways. A scholarship to the neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater in New York redirected his entire trajectory. He threw himself into it completely, performing in more than 50 plays and 3 Broadway productions before a single camera ever pointed at him. When Hollywood finally came calling, he was ready in a way that most young stars never are, not just talented, but deeply prepared. His screen debut in The Keys of the Kingdom in 1944 earned him his first Academy Award nomination. He was 28 years old. The trajectory from there looked inevitable in hindsight, though nothing ever is. But alongside the rising career, a personal life was also taking shape. And that personal life would become the most complicated, the most quietly painful, and ultimately the most profoundly beautiful story Gregory Peck ever lived through. In 1942, Gregory Peck married Greta Kukkonen, a Finnish-born woman he had met during his early New York years. Together they had 3 sons, Jonathan, Stephen, and Carrie. From the outside, it looked exactly like what the studios wanted, a handsome, principled leading man with a respectable family at home. The reality was more complicated. Acting careers, especially during the golden age of Hollywood, were consuming things. Long shoots. Endless publicity. Travel that pulled you away from home for months at a stretch. Greta and Gregory's marriage began fraying under the weight of those distances, not just physical distances but emotional ones too. The warmth that had drawn them together seemed, over time, to cool. Friends from that era who spoke candidly about those years described Gregory Peck as a man who carried a particular kind of loneliness even in rooms full of people. Not self-pity. Not bitterness. Just a quiet awareness that something essential was missing. That the version of his life visible in the fan magazines was a carefully constructed surface, and underneath it, the emotional reality was far more uncertain. He threw himself into work. Picture after picture. Gentleman's Agreement. The Gunfighter. Roman Holiday. Cape Fear. Each one demanding. Each one rewarded. The career was extraordinary by any measure. And yet close observers noticed that the films that seemed to draw the deepest performances from him were always the ones about men caught between duty and desire. Men who had given something up. Men who carried a quiet, aching awareness of roads not taken. Coincidence, perhaps. Artists often reach into their own experience for emotional truth. But for Gregory Peck, that emotional experience was about to change dramatically. In 1953, while filming Roman Holiday in Paris, he met a 21-year-old French journalist named Véronique Passani. She was not a film star. She was not trying to be discovered. She was a journalist, assigned to interview him, and she arrived with questions that were sharper and more interesting than any he'd been asked in years. Véronique Passani was 21 years old, French-born, educated, elegant, and possessed of an intellectual confidence that most women in Hollywood's orbit had been carefully trained to suppress. She did not suppress it. She asked what she wanted to ask. She said what she thought. And she looked at Gregory Peck not with the reverence of a fan but with the curiosity of someone genuinely trying to understand who he actually was. He was disarmed almost immediately. Those who witnessed their first meeting described an almost visible shift in Gregory Peck's demeanor. The controlled composure he brought to every public interaction softened. He became more open, more animated, more present. The journalist from Paris had done in one conversation what years of Hollywood glamour had failed to do. She'd made him feel genuinely seen. The interview led to more conversations. More conversations led to a friendship. The friendship led to something neither of them had entirely planned. Gregory Peck's marriage to Greta Kukkonen ended in 1954. And in 1955, Gregory Peck and Véronique Passani were married. What followed was not a Hollywood romance in the glossy, manufactured sense. It was something quieter, more durable, and ultimately more rare. Véronique was not interested in becoming an ornament on his arm. She had her own mind, her own opinions, her own aesthetic sensibilities. She pushed back when she disagreed with him. She challenged his thinking. She kept him honest in a way that the perpetual yes of the entertainment industry never could. And Gregory Peck, who had grown up watching the world from a careful distance, found in her someone who refused to let him maintain that distance from his own life. They had 2 children together, Cecilia and Anthony. The family settled between Los Angeles and a farmhouse in France, a deliberate choice that reflected Véronique's influence. Away from the machinery of Hollywood, at least part of the time. Grounded in something real. The years that followed were not without tragedy. In 1975, Gregory Peck's eldest son Jonathan took his own life. The grief was devastating and lasting. People who saw Peck in the months and years after Jonathan's death described a man visibly altered by the loss, quieter, heavier, carrying a weight that never entirely lifted. He spoke about Jonathan rarely in public, but when he did, it was clear the wound had never fully healed. Through all of it, Veronique stayed. That sounds simple. It isn't. Grief of that magnitude reshapes people. It can pull couples apart just as surely as it can press them together. For Gregory and Veronique, the loss seemed to deepen something between them rather than fracture it. Shared grief, navigated together over years, has a way of revealing the truest nature of a bond. She also remained his fiercest advocate in the quieter, less visible ways. Managing the household. Shaping the tone of their shared life. Curating the social world around him with a discernment that reflected her own intelligence and taste. Veronique was not a woman who faded into the background of anyone's life, including Gregory Peck's. Friends from those later decades consistently described the same picture, a couple who had grown into each other, who had built something that neither could have built alone. The playful French journalist who had once sat across a table and refused to be dazzled had become the center of gravity around which his entire personal world orbited. Gregory Peck said, in interviews from his 60s and 70s, that the great luck of his life was his marriage to Veronique. Not his Oscar. Not his career. Not Atticus Finch. His marriage. He said it quietly, the way he said most things that mattered deeply. Without performance. Without flourish. Just a man telling the truth about where his heart lived. As Gregory Peck moved into his 80s, he became more reflective in his public conversations. The careful control of earlier decades relaxed slightly. The private man began to surface more openly. In interviews and in the memoir-adjacent conversations he allowed near the end of his life, he returned again and again to Veronique. Not in the abstract way public figures sometimes speak about their spouses, the polished tribute offered for public consumption. In a specific, personal, almost vulnerable way. He spoke about the afternoon they first met and how her questions had startled him into attention. He spoke about the way she had always told him the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. He spoke about raising their children together and about surviving together the losses that no amount of fame or success can shield a person from. He spoke about what it felt like to be truly known by another person. Not the curated public version of yourself. Not the movie star. The actual human being, with all his uncertainties and grief and private failures. Gregory Peck told the people closest to him, and eventually the wider world, that Veronique was the only person in his life who had ever known him that completely. And he was grateful, he said. Profoundly, almost overwhelmingly grateful. Because he knew enough about life by then to understand how rare that was. Most people never find it. Some find it and lose it. He had found it, kept it, and been kept by it for nearly half a century. He died on June 12, 2003, in Los Angeles. He was 87 years old. Veronique was at his side. There is a tendency, when we talk about the great figures of classic Hollywood, to separate the personal life from the professional one. To discuss the films as one story and the marriage as another. But for Gregory Peck, those two stories were always deeply entangled. The characters he chose to play were almost never simple heroes. They were men trying to be good in circumstances that made goodness difficult. Men who understood the cost of doing the right thing and paid it anyway. Men who loved with a kind of steadiness that asked nothing for itself. Atticus Finch is the most famous version of that archetype, but it runs through his entire filmography if you look for it. Where did that instinct come from? Some of it came from the discipline of his upbringing. Some from the literary imagination nurtured by his grandmother and his studies at Berkeley. But some of it, surely, came from lived experience. From knowing what it felt like to be in a partnership built on genuine respect and genuine love. From having, in Veronique, a model for what real devotion looks like, not dramatic, not loud, but consistent, honest, and permanent. The love he and Veronique built together over nearly 5 decades was not the love of the movies he starred in. It was quieter than that. more ordinary in its daily texture. But precisely because of its quietness, it was also more real. More earned. More lasting. He knew that. That was why, when he finally said it plainly, that she was the one, that the great love of his life was the woman who had walked into a room in Paris with a notebook and refused to be impressed by him, there was no drama in the statement. No revelation designed for effect. Just a man, at the end of a long life, naming the thing that had mattered most. Gregory Peck's films remain. Atticus Finch remains. The Oscar, the AFI honors, the Kennedy Center tributes, those remain too. History has been generous with his public legacy, and rightly so. But those who study him most carefully, who read the interviews and speak with those who knew him personally, tend to arrive at the same conclusion: the real measure of this man was not on the screen. It was in the life he chose to live away from it. He could have chased the mythology of Hollywood stardom and lost himself in it entirely. Many did. He chose differently. He chose Veronique, and the life they built together, and the values that kept him from becoming merely a symbol. In the end, the most important role Gregory Peck ever played was not Atticus Finch. It was himself. A man who understood that love, real love, is not a grand gesture performed for an audience. It is a choice made every day, in private, over years. A choice to show up, to stay, to tell the truth, and to be grateful for the person sitting across from you who is doing exactly the same. He made that choice. He kept it. And before he died, he said so. That is the story behind the legend. That is the love behind the icon.